Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Policy Exchange for what I think is, I'm very sure is going to be an excellent debate on the future of onshore wind turbines in the UK. For those of you who don't know, I'm Guy Newey. I'm Head of Environment and Energy at Policy Exchange. The development of onshore wind in the UK has proven a little controversial. Well, it's certainly controversial in Westminster, although whether the rest of the world sees it in such terms, I'm not sure. While there seems to be majority support for land-based wind turbines among the public in polls, some MPs are less than fervent in their support. More than 100 Tories signed a letter a year ago, or just over a year ago, against onshore subsidies. And perhaps partly as a response, perhaps not, the government has recently unveiled a new way of how the planning system deals with onshore wind, including a beefed up consultation process and what I think we sadly have to call improved community incentives. Today we want to examine some of those issues and assess whether the government's new proposals will make a difference. Some facts to start the debate. There are currently around 4,100 wind turbines in the UK. There's around 2,900 under construction. A further 3,000 are working their way through the planning system. How many more might we need if we want to meet our 2050 carbon targets? Of course, it depends what else we do. David Mackay's numbers for DEC say it could be as many as 20,000, or he also puts forward a scenario where it could be none. I think we'll all agree at the top end of these predictions, this could mean quite a radical change for the UK's landscape. At Policy Exchange, our focus has always been on how we achieve environmental and in particular climate targets as cost effectively as possible. We therefore see a crucial role for onshore wind. And the question we always ask of critics of onshore wind is, if you don't do onshore wind, what do you do? Offshore wind may be out of sight, but it is expensive in comparison. And other options, including nuclear, don't look as if they're going to be particularly cheap. We've called for improvements to the planning system to encourage more energy infrastructure in general, and onshore wind in particular, and clever incentives. In fact, we think more use of direct benefits to people affected by development is much needed generally in a country where getting anything built is proving increasingly difficult, whether it's new houses, high-speed 2, or indeed the energy we're talking about. So I just posit the thought that it may be that onshore wind opens up opportunities in the planning system for more use of what politicians are reluctant to bribes or incentives or inducements. Anyway, today we have an excellent panel to discuss these issues. Our first speaker will be Ed Davey, who's been the MP for Kingston and Surbiton since 1997, and he's been Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change since early last year. About the same time as the Tory MP's letter came out, I think it was... On the same day. Oh, right. Well, that's lovely welcome for you. Mr. Davey is obviously fresh from tussling with Russell Brand on question time, so he'll be well prepared. That was Melanie Phillips easier than Russell Brand.
Melanie Phillips.
Yes. Mav Smith is the Deputy Chief Executive of Renewable UK, who is the trade association for many renewable technologies, including onshore and offshore wind. MAF has a long background in renewable energy and energy policy, including a stint at DEC. He took up his current post last year. And our final speaker today is Dr. Richard Cowell, who is a reader in environmental planning at Cardiff University. He's an expert in the planning system and renewable energy, and in particular community benefits. So he's going to tell us today whether the government proposals are going to work. He's done an excellent pamphlet for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which is, some of the copies are available at the back, so feel free to grab some of those. Each speaker has been given strict instructions to speak for no longer than 8 minutes, which will leave us with plenty of time for questions from the floor, and we will finish at bang on 3 o'clock. And with that, I'll ask Ed Davey to speak first.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today to talk about, as you've noted, a little bit of a controversial subject in my portfolio. Before I get into the meat, I just want to remind people what the objectives of energy policy are, because there are 3 objectives. First of all, to keep the lights on, energy security. Obviously, that's a critical role of government, and we've got to replace 20% of our electricity generating capacity in the next decade. And then, of course, the next issue is making sure that energy is affordable, both for consumers and for businesses. We've seen a lot of volatility over the decades with fossil fuel prices, and most recently, global gas prices have been pushing up electricity and gas bills in the UK. And so one of the arguments for a more diverse approach to energy is that we can use more homegrown renewables, but also energy like nuclear and CCS, and they will become cheaper over time and protect us from this volatility of fossil fuel prices. And the third objective, after affordability and energy security, is cutting our carbon emissions. That's both to meet our legal obligations under the Climate Change Act and because that is the right thing to do. Those 3 objectives actually give us a real opportunity to grow our economy at the moment. Energy investment has a potential to stimulate a lot of economic activity and provide growth. So it's one thing that I think you'll hear this week in particular, but it's a mantra that I've been continue using since I became Secretary of State. The other issue that I've really begun to understand a little bit better since becoming Secretary of State is the fact that there's no silver bullet in energy policy. Often people tell you, if only you did this, you'd sort out our problems overnight. This is the way forward, and they say it with huge conviction, and then when you analyse it, there's a few more uncertainties than they were telling you. And I think every option has uncertainty. Oil and gas, it's what our energy is built on at the moment, but we have the emissions. You can have interruption of supply, you can have volatility in prices, as we've discussed. And we don't know what the future of gas prices will be. At the moment, the independent analysts think that gas prices are going to stay high and go higher, even with shale gas coming on stream with some optimistic numbers. So we don't know the price of gas long term, and I think that creates uncertainty there. With respect to shale gas, we are trying our very best to make sure we can exploit this safely, but we don't know whether the UK geology will enable us to get all that's there. Obviously, we hope we can. We don't know, though, the numbers with respect to recoverability, with respect to whether it's commercially viable, whether it's publicly acceptable, but clearly we want to try that option. Nuclear, we all know the issues, but particularly on cost, which is, as you rightly obsessing us, we need to try to get nuclear costs down as much as possible, but we don't know what that trajectory will eventually be. CCS, while it's actually a proven technology, we don't know whether it's going to be commercially viable by the time you put all the different pieces of the supply chain for CCS together. And with renewables, you could take all the many different types of renewables and you could ask, where is the cost curve going? And the truth is, we can't be sure on almost any of the technologies. They look like they're all going in the right direction, but we don't know how fast and whether that decline will be sustained. And with particular renewable technologies, you've got individual concerns. With onshore wind, of course, we have people who are concerned about the landscape impact and about the intermittency and other things as well. So there's uncertainty everywhere you look. And the question is, how do you manage that? And we believe you need to manage that by very clearly going for a diverse approach and ultimately by a market approach. Although we're having to move from a current electricity market which favours fossil fuels to an electricity market through electricity market reform and an energy bill which will favour low carbon in whatever form that low carbon is generated, CCS, nuclear or renewables. So that's the basic pitch. But what is absolutely clear, we can't meet our objectives without renewables. David Mackay is very clear. They will play a critical place, and onshore wind has been playing a critical place in the renewable story. And it's quite clear why that should be. It's a proven technology, first of all. It's already providing over 3% of our current electricity mix. We expect that to go up to maybe 14% by the end of the decade, powering nearly 8 million homes. It's already cut emissions. By the end of 2011, it was cut the emissions equivalent to the carbon footprint of a city the size of Leeds. It's cost effective. Although people try to tell you that it's costing you huge amounts, it's costing actually the average household £6 a year in the total energy bill. And the costs are reducing. We've reduced the support levels for onshore wind by 10% this year. And while we need economic activity, it is also playing a role in green growth, and we are seeing jobs rising. Already nearly 9,000 jobs, and we expect that to rise to at least 15,000 by the end of the decade in onshore wind alone. So onshore wind at the moment is the cheapest and most mature renewable technology. That's why it's been the most dominant in the renewables mix, and we expect it to be producing just short of half of our renewable electricity by 2020. After that, it's going to have to be competing ever more fiercely with other renewables and other low carbon. We're expecting the cost of offshore wind, for example, to come down fiercely. So probably by the end of the 2020s, it won't be quite so dominant, partly because other renewables and other low carbon will have developed. But it clearly is a critical part of the mix. And you talked about the figures about how much is coming from wind, onshore wind. At the moment, it's about 6.3 gigawatts of electricity. If you look at what's in the planning system, there's 6.7 gigawatts that's already received planning permission and is under construction. And there's approximately 5.7 gigawatts in the planning system, and that will be considered under the new planning guidelines. If you add all those numbers up, you'll see quite a large number. We don't expect it all to get permission, all to get built. In the renewables roadmap, we talk possibly up to 13 gigawatts by 2020. That wasn't a target, that was a sort of milestone, a sort of potential scenario. You're right that no one can be absolutely clear about the support for any particular form of energy, and it will differ from people's experiences. But if you look broadly, 8 out of 10 people say they support renewable energy, and that's a much higher figure than other forms of energy. And if you look at onshore wind in particular, it depends on the survey, depends on the time, but between about 65 and 70% registering support for onshore wind. But the opposition has to be taken seriously. And not just because I get a letter from 100 MPs, so that is important in itself, because I don't think anyone would want to foist particular technologies or installations on particular communities. We want to understand those concerns, and we've been looking at them in detail, whether there's issues around wildlife, whether there's issues around landscape, issues around noise, issues around the impact on aviation. We do and have taken those seriously. But when onshore wind is appropriately cited, I think all those issues have proved and will prove to be insurmountable. The new planning guidance, I think, will help people understand what is already there in the national planning policy framework, and I hope that will help people. We also wanted to make sure that people were consulted earlier, so the DCLG will be consulting on the proposals for compulsory pre-application consultation later this year. I think that will hopefully improve the standard of developer and community engagement. And of course, we have a community benefit package, which is voluntary, it is industry-led, but we've engaged with the industry, and the industry have looked at best practice and agreed to take this proposal forward, where their benefit package will increase in England fivefold from roughly £1,000 per megawatt capacity per year to £5,000. So that's a significant increase, and I think will reassure many people. Of course, we don't know precisely what the impact of the new planning guidance will be and the new community benefit package will be. In terms of the consent rate, in terms of the amount of onshore wind coming forward and the speed at which it will come forward. It might be a little more, it might be a little less. No one, of course, knows. But we can be confident that the combination will mean that more onshore wind is sited in the right place and there is stronger community support and benefit for it. So I think you will see onshore wind projects continuing to receive planning permission, and I think they will continue to play a big part in our energy going forward. So I'm looking forward to the debate. Now we've concluded our decisions on this, I hope we can win increasing support both for renewables and onshore wind, but also about the approach we've taken, which I think is an approach which has listened to people's concerns and responded appropriately. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. In terms of the title of the debate, should this lead to more wind farms? I would say, as a starting point, yes. And building on what the Secretary of State says, there is clearly public support for renewable energy, and that includes onshore wind. I think I can't do this talk without referencing, as Guy says, there is political, at least in Westminster, this is a hot topic. It's not that out there in terms of when schemes come forwards, there aren't people talking about the pros and cons of schemes, but clearly in Westminster, this is something which excites a lot of attention. And with the coalition government, it's clear that there were different interpretations perhaps as what this meant. But I think that's also not just within parties, but within departments. And we have, as an industry, to work closely with DEC, but also with CLG, which looks after planning, also, of course, with Treasury and BIS and others. And I think it is important to be clear about what the onshore review is telling us and what it will mean. And what it will mean is that the planning process takes a central point in this. It's worth referencing that it was said, some of the briefings were about that communities will be able to stop schemes they don't want. And there was a question as to, asked by Eric Pickles, saying that wind farm proposals can be unwelcome to local communities. But I would contest those statements as absolute statements. And I would start by asking you, what is a community? And how do you define a community? And how do you define, therefore, what, if you like, the will of the community is? And we need to be very careful when any type of development comes forward that we're clear about who supports what or on what conditions. And so what the government has done in terms of encouraging greater and earlier engagement by developers with the community is beneficial, because it's that conversation you can have with the community about what is proposed, where it will be, what it will look like, what the associated benefits will be, which is really important for helping people understand a development, what an infrastructure, what any change might be. And that's important because if you, as the Secretary of State says, if you look at the polling, people support renewables and they support onshore wind. Polling also shows that people in rural areas are more supportive of onshore wind than they are in urban areas. So people, if you like, with more direct experience respond positively. There are in-depth studies, for example, in Northern Ireland and Scotland, which ask people before and after schemes were developed, their views, and they find more favourable attitudes after. And that broadly shows that if done well, schemes, people will have concerns. Those concerns can be addressed. People can be put at ease, if you will. And then life moves on and people say, yeah, I can see the benefit of that. But a question then is how we also talk about the wider benefit. This is something people need to understand, that we need energy in its simplest form, but also that we need to make a shift from how we've used energy today in reliance, say, upon oil and gas, coal, to low carbon forms of generation. And we need to think about both where that comes from in terms of importing and reducing the impacts of that. And therefore, onshore wind energy is really important. So the planning process is going to be where a lot of these debates are had. And I think it's important to say, therefore, what is the community? Well, the will of the community has to be expressed through planning in the local plan. But clearly for developers, we have to be sure that the decisions being taken by local authorities are appropriate, are based on the facts, are objective. And that can be a challenge, and is something that the government's commitment to planning guidance is welcome, because that helps to lay out what is appropriate in what circumstances. It's also, though, worth flagging about, thinking about polling and what might happen. We've now had this review. It's not now as if this issue is going to go away. It's not as if the Secretary of State's not going to have any more correspondence on this. But if you go and ask people on the ground about what they feel, and particularly if you go and ask them related to their voting intentions, what you find is that as a voter group, if you ask them for what they would be likely to do if a candidate at the next election were to come out in opposition to a proposed wind farm, clearly there are going to be some people who would say, you get my vote, that's great, I don't want that to be here either. But actually, less people would give them their vote if they came out against the wind farm than would withdraw their vote if they came out against a wind farm. So for a would-be political candidate to use wind energy as a way of hoovering up votes would be very misguided. And that's not just amongst the different parties. If you look at the different political affiliations, you find that. And so, for example, within the Conservative Party, 33% of would-be Conservative voters would be less likely to vote for a candidate who did not support a wind farm than the 31% who would be more likely. Put simply, it's a zero-sum game. You can lose as many people as you might attract. So wind farms, but broadly shows that most other people, this is not an issue. It's not a voting issue for them. They want to know that decisions being made well, but equally there are more pressing concerns that exercise them when they think about which party to cast a vote for. So I think these guidance lines we have will help. The pre-application, as I said, will provide reassurance by starting that conversation earlier. The proposal for a register about how community benefits are delivered will help, because it gives accurate, it gives open information. Everyone knows what is happening on the ground. Communities can learn from each other. Guidance about how schemes come forward will help, because again, you have informed communities able to engage on a one-to-one footing with developers. And action in terms of focus on the supply chain is equally valuable, because it is in the local benefits and people seeing the jobs come forward from schemes where they again start to see additional reasons for support. And we already see that a lot of those benefits from wind farms are being delivered. For each megawatt installed, there's approximately £100,000 over a lifetime of a scheme accruing to those local communities. And while there is more to do in terms of some of the wider supply chain benefits, particularly say a debate about offshore wind, onshore, that we are seeing very localised, regional-based industries around the onshore community and onshore proposals. And if you look at what is happening in planning in terms of schemes coming forwards, we've actually seen over the last couple of years the consenting rates are going up. And looking at England alone, consenting rates last year compared to the year before increased from 45% to 58%. And we think that's for a few reasons. We think it's because of reforms to planning that this government has introduced. But we also think it's about developers working well with communities and engaging actively to address concerns that communities might have, and about them citing schemes appropriately, so coming up with the right schemes, the right size schemes in the right locations. And we think local authorities are responding to that in terms of the consenting rates going up. So overall, there is a trend here, industry working well, industry putting forward responsible schemes, working with the guidance and supporting what government is trying to do, but engaging with communities so that both the community and our needs as an economy which needs to generate these new sources of low carbon generation can all benefit. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. So, will community incentives lead to more wind farms? That is the question, or at least it's a question I'm going to start with. I mean, on the one hand, this should be quite straightforward to answer, because it's already been the norm. Wind farm developers in the UK provide some form of community benefits. And the recent announcements from DEC about pushing for high levels of benefit through the Industry Concord Act, that could best be seen as a sort of modest undergirding of current best practice. Many developers, particularly of larger wind farms, perhaps in windier sites in Wales and Scotland, are already offering £5,000 per megawatt per annum or more. So it might mean that we should hope to answer this question from the evidence and experience. On the other hand, there hasn't really been much systematic analysis of whether community incentives affect wind energy development outcomes. We have a lot of anecdotes. We have quite a few case studies. Some show people responding positively to community benefits, others that they generate negativity and antipathy. We have quite decent reviews of the levels and forms of community benefits that the industry has provided, but little systematic research that tries to link community benefit inputs to changes in local acceptability and in turn to wind energy development outcomes. So the overall effect is rather uncertain, but I think we probably have good reasons to believe that the effects are likely on their own to be modest. The first factor, and Matt has hinted at this, is that for all the talk about the community which might benefit, the people who might be persuaded by community incentives fall into a number of different categories. There are those who are already positive or acquiescent about the prospect of a wind farm on their doorstep, whose attitudes scarcely need shifting by extra incentives. Then there are those whose stance is negative for pretty non-negotiable reasons, very typically because for them the effects on the landscape and visual amenity are serious and cannot be remedied by some kind of compensatory payment. And then there are those whose attitude to wind power is in some way conditional, either on the quality of the public engagement process or perhaps because of the community benefits on offer. And these are ones whose opinion might be changed. My point is simply that community incentives will only change attitudes in places where most people fall into category 3. They are the conditionals, if you like, and it's just hard to predict whether that's a high proportion of the populace in different places. As well, though, as the uncertainties of public attitudes, you then have the fuzzy relationship between public attitudes and how people will then act in the decision-making process. It's simply unclear whether providing more or better community benefits encourages people that have been acquiescent or are conditional supporters to start pressing on their councillors and pressing on their MPs and to do so with the force that wind energy opponents have done. And on top of all that, and further muddying the water, community benefits have an uncertain standing in the planning system itself. Some planning lawyers would have suggested that they cannot legally have any incentive effect on planning decisions. Then we might discuss whether something subtle is changing about the planning process here. So for those three sets of reasons, that three-card trick, if you like, I think it's unlikely that the new moves on community incentives will significantly affect wind energy decisions. As a policy lever for promoting wind energy development, it's a pretty rubbery one. But it doesn't mean that community benefits are irrelevant, and I'd actually say that disentangling them from something which is designed to achieve development outcomes actually allows us to frame policy around some rather better questions. Instead of simply asking, how do we manipulate local attitudes to achieve the quickest low-carbon energy transition, we could ask more often, how do we achieve the best low-carbon transition? And that's important because in that context, the role of community benefits might be more about justice, more about improving the lives and development prospects of communities living with large infrastructure that feels the harms of their surroundings. And in fact, to give them credit, the government's language does seem to be moving much more in this direction, with a lot less hopeful talk about encouraging social acceptance and much more talk about sharing the benefits. The policy rationale for community benefits now seems to be much more about redistributing the benefits of resource exploitation, capturing, if you like, some of the value of land exploitation for those that live near development, which is fine. Politically, it's quite a radical tradition. It's interesting. Though clearly, there could be many other categories of development to which that should apply. Focusing our attention on the best low-carbon transition leads us to think more widely about what might be the best use or form of community benefits. My own view, for what it's worth, is that the funds should be invested by communities in ways which deliver lasting flows of benefits, such that their society, economy, and environment are left more resilient when the benefit flows from wind energy finally come to an end. using community benefit funds to help finance community-owned renewable energy is a particularly interesting opportunity. It's interesting because community-owned renewable energy schemes typically achieve more pounds per megawatt than community benefits from commercial schemes. They tend to attract a little less opposition, though not just because of the benefits, but because often there's a higher degree of community control associated with such projects. And moreover, and the third point would be that the money that may be heading towards communities from community benefits under this move towards 5,000 per megawatt as a standard is pretty comparable in terms of sums of money to the amounts that governments allocate through grant and loan schemes to community renewables, such as the proposed Rural Community Energy Fund. So that would be my view. The only problem with it, and with any firm position on the use of community benefit funds, is that communities and companies, to some extent, don't much like being told how community benefits should be spent. That, at least, I think we do know. Which brings me finally to the joker in the pack, providing community benefits in the form of reduced energy bills or some other form of direct individual payment. I call it the joker because although it's been pretty much touted in some of the recent press releases, it's a new practice. We know even less about whether or not this will change local attitudes to wind farms for the better or for the worse. But I think we can say a couple of things about it as a principle. The first is that this is quite an individualised form of community benefit, whereas traditional practice in the UK has generally made funds collectively available for community social projects. More fundamentally, perhaps, if you take these individual payments to community members, if you add them to CLG's proposed rebalancing of planning policy to give local people more say over wind farm proposals, then it seems to me that you're smuggling in, for wind energy at least, a much more decentralised and marketised form of planning than many in the UK have traditionally been very comfortable with. It also starts to dramatically reframe some of our strategic questions. The answer to the question, what is the right amount of onshore wind in our energy mix, becomes as much or as little as local residents can be paid to accept. And you might wonder if this on its own is an adequate governance response to a long-term challenge like climate change. Okay, thanks.
There'll be a mic in a sec, I'll open up to questions, but I'm just going to come back on some of the points that were raised. Richard, to you, Ed. Richard said at the end that in many ways this is a kind of new mechanism. I mean, do you see this as being at the vanguard of changes to the planning system more generally in terms of how we get new energy and wider infrastructure built?
Well, in terms of energy, the government is talking about community benefits with respect to new nuclear, with respect to shale gas. So you are seeing that within the areas that I'm responsible for. I always tread rather gingerly onto other colleagues' areas. But the last time I think was at Policy Exchange was when you were debating a pamphlet called Community Land Auctions, which was put forward by Dr. Tim Loynig, and is an area of planning policy which I personally am very keen on and have argued within my own party. So that sort of slight radical approach, decentralised approach, I think has a lot of merit.
Okay, let's open it up to some questions. I'd ask that people identify where they're from and keep their questions as short as possible. There's a man with his arm up there.
Hi, I'm Bruce Davis from Abundance Generation. We fund renewable energy using the general public's money from £5 minimum investment. And I guess my question is, are we looking at the right incentives still? Have we moved the narrative on? Because I think the problem with the community benefit payment is it's still about them and us. We're making a payment to the community. And what we've found we've done 2.3 million of projects this year, and we found that you can change the narrative by allowing people to invest directly. And you can still do community benefit payments as well. I think in our turbine we did about £15,000 a year out of a half megawatt turbine. So you can generate significant benefits to the local community, but the fundamental thing is that they feel their objectives are aligned with the developer because they're invested with the developer, and they both make a return based on the amount of energy produced. So are we still maintaining that distance between ourselves and the community, and shouldn't we be bringing the community a little bit closer, whether it's on an individual basis as an investor or as a community benefiting from it?
Richard, can I go to you first, then I'll go to you.
I think it's a good question. I mean, what often brings up in my mind is the rather simplistic comparisons that are made between community benefits in the UK and what's happened in Germany and Denmark around renewable energy, where people see a lot more community engagement in and ownership of renewables as one of the factors in helping wind energy roll out more successfully. But of course, it's always been a much more popular social movement right from the start in Denmark and Germany. And it's much more difficult in the UK 20 years on, as you say, to kind of graft on like a communitarian dimension to an essentially unchanged, predominantly commercial mode of delivery.
Well, first of all, in our call for evidence and in our consultation, our response to that, we made it clear that we are interested in community ownership, and we've linked that into our call for evidence on a community energy. We'll be publishing in the autumn, probably in October, November, a strategy, the country's first ever strategy on community energy, where we're looking at all aspects of energy, purchasing energy, managing energy, saving energy, and generating energy. And that's where we will flesh out further the ideas in exactly the area you describe. And the pots of money that are available through community benefit, through the new approach, ultimately we think that should be a decision for the community working with the developer. And one option is to use that pot to invest in the scheme. But in the call for evidence on community energy strategy, we're looking at a whole range of other areas of ways that you can get finance into this sector for community-owned renewable energy, both directly owned, indirectly owned, and indeed in terms of communities having joint ventures with developers themselves. So there's certainly not one size fits all, but I think the ownership question is a really interesting one, and we are very much exploring that and want to come forward with positions in the autumn.
Do you have any thoughts on why it hasn't exploded in the UK as it has in Germany and other markets?
Primarily, I think, because our subsidy schemes have been less generous. I think at the moment, the German consumer is paying 7 billion euros a year to subsidise solar. That's more than all of our subsidies for all our renewables put together with a multiple. So it's quite attractive, and therefore it's relatively easy to create community organisations. However, I think, which is right, is that there was already a movement both in Denmark and Germany for which those subsidy regimes could latch onto, and that's a bit more nascent in the UK.
And I think if you compare how, for example, we've run our system here to Germany and Denmark, there has been much more, wider interest. But equally, some of those support schemes, some of the early German and Danish schemes, were basically tax break schemes. So they only benefited more affluent households. So you're saying to, German dentists can get richer on German wind farms. They're not community schemes where the benefits are really shared. So we have to be careful we do that. And I think the community review that the government is undertaking is an opportunity, but it has to not be about small scale, single turbines next to the village hall type schemes. They have to look at different models. And we were certainly keen in our work that we did in the current review. We promoted schemes such as green ISAs, so people have easy investment routes they can look to put money in and see the direct benefit of that in terms of schemes coming forwards.
Bruce, do you want to come back on any of that? Or?
Yeah, I think the key thing, I think it's good to hear that the word ownership has got several definitions now, because I think the worry was that what we were looking at was a small-scale idea of community, and as Matt was saying, the communities are as big as we want to make it. Actually, renewable energy has an opportunity to galvanise larger-scale communities, and we're looking at a scheme in Chester where it's a large-scale £3 million scheme that's going to take the whole of Chester to finance that. And you need the right vehicles then to provide that investment in a way that's safe for the investor, and provides that return, but is also open to everybody. So we're still trying to come up with the right models.
Do respond to our call for evidence.
Little doubt here. I'm going to take some questions. I'm going to take one at the front there, and then I'll take the second right at the back. Yeah.
Hi, Mikesh Mistry from the Taxpayers Alliance. So in this debate, we've had four guys who have all given an answer to the question, do we need more onshore wind farms? As yes, 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 yes. Some debate. I mention this because you've talked about the public opinion which is generally in favour of more wind turbines. However, if you look at the polling, where the people who actually live where wind farms are going to be, and in other rural countryside areas, the polling gives a very different picture. And I mention this because I think one of you said a candidate coming out against wind farms is a zero-sum game. For a certain political party, it's not a zero-sum game. What are your thoughts on the UKIP aspect and wind farms? Thank you.
Okay, so hold that thought. UKIP and what it means for onshore wind, and then the lady right at the back there.
Thanks. Carol Walter from Bond Dickinson.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit, please?
Is this coming through?
Yeah.
Right. Carol Walter from Bond Dickinson. I'm referring here to the government response to the onshore wind call for evidence. And in it is said that DEC will support communities to negotiate appropriate benefit packages. Now, this language strongly implies, it seems to me, that communities have a bargaining position, and then that position is presumably based somehow on influencing the planning outcome. First of all, there isn't that direct link, as was said earlier, and secondly, it's illegal for incentives, inducements to influence the planning outcome. So my question is, what does government think, how will this negotiation tie in with the pre-application consultation procedures to be introduced? And also, does the government have any advice for local planning authorities as to how they should consider such bargaining in their planning decisions? Thank you.
Do you want to come back on either of those points, Ed?
I'll do both. I mean, seems most of the time the debate is quite the reverse, that you only hear from people who are against it. So it's quite refreshing to be on a platform where there are more people in favour of it. So I'm very happy to be on a platform with people who are against it at the same time. Some might say within government I've had that experience. So I don't think it's quite as imbalanced as you would suggest. In terms of the opinion polls, you probably know a little bit more about the absolute detail, but I've certainly noted that when you've gone to areas that have had them, and you've had before and after, you've seen a big switch when they've been built, and that's not uncommon in planning and development. Actually, I've seen that in housing developments in my own constituency. People, once they're built, actually often say, "Well, I don't know what all the fuss was about." That's not for everybody. There will still be who will be die-hard opponents all the way through, and they may be sizable. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than you implied. If UKIP wish to take on their climate change denying philosophy and oppose renewables, that would at least be consistent, which it makes change. The issue about planning and community benefit, they are separate. In the document you read, it was clear they are separate, and they're separate processes. But there will be a fund. The industry developer would come forward separate to the planning process, and there would be a discussion about that fund. And in terms of helping, it's by having a register where communities could look at this register, look around the country, what other communities have done in terms of negotiating this deal. They will look at all the best practice that we're able to point to and the guidance. So I think that will be a help, but it is separate from the planning process.
Baf, do you want to come in?
So on the polling out element you mentioned, of the four parties where we've looked at polls and attitudes, a UKIP candidate would be the only one where they might derive any benefit. But equally, there are UKIP-leaning voters who would be less likely to vote for a candidate if they came out against a wind farm. So it is not a cut and dried issue, and I think that's all I'm trying to say. If you were a candidate at the next election, you cannot make simple assumptions just by what you might see on the letters pages of your paper. There are lots of diverse attitudes in terms of what people think about wind farms, and they relate primarily to how well those wind farms are developed and how well the developer engages. They are overlaid with views on climate change, views on gas, views on energy bills. But primarily it's about making sure those are good schemes coming forwards. And I think that goes to your point as well about the local planning process and how local authorities engage. Making sure that local authorities have clear local plans, making sure that those local plans have been produced on evidence of what is necessary or what developments are appropriate for the area, and making sure they then follow that through into decision making helps the community in terms of knowing what is likely, but also equally helps developers of any form of development of infrastructure know what they should be proposing or seeking to do.
Okay, and just, sorry, I'll interrupt because you accused us of running an unfair debate. I'll just say that we, at Policy Exchange, we have had a wide range of speakers on this issue. We've had Pielka, we've had Lombard, we've had Peter Lilly come and debate these issues. So I challenge your premise on which we don't have a fair debate. And of course, you're here to ask the questions. And I think our record on opposition to subsidy is pretty well established. Okay, Simon there, and then I'll take this lady at the front.
Get the coffee out of the way. Simon Roberts from the Centre for Sustainable Energy. I think we're missing a step ahead of this kind of get better at planning, get better at development, which is actually to involve the public in an understanding of what the transition that's required in our energy system and therefore in our society and lives actually means. And there was a very brief 2 paragraphs in the document from DEC around upstream community engagement, as I think it got called, which I'm sure there's a song about. But that issue around how we get communities to understand the kind of local dimension of a low carbon transition, what that means in terms of their landscape, their buildings, the way they need to live their lives, we've just kind of completely missed it out. The kind of Westminster Village has been very happily setting targets, but at no point involved anyone in a discussion about why they were there and what it means in their locality. So I wonder whether in the discussions you had with your coalition government colleagues, you ever discussed the possibility of making low carbon objectives a mandatory requirement within neighbourhood planning.
Okay, hold that thought, and we'll take the question from the woman in the second row there.
Emily Beeman from the Press Association. At the time of the announcement, there were some concerns raised, I think by Renewable UK, that the increased level of benefits could make a number of wind farm projects unviable. Given that the benefits are unlikely to convince anybody who is vocally opposed, combined with the chance that some projects might drop out of the system, is there a danger that, in fact, just the benefits on their own, without even worrying about the changes to the planning system, will, in fact, bring the number of schemes that go ahead down?
Matt, do you want to answer that one?
So,
we're not going to have more, we're going to have fewer.
So in the short term, there is a danger of that, because we need to make sure that schemes can go ahead and schemes are viable. So, but alongside that, the UK government has been looking at what support onshore wind needs in terms of the RO mechanism, and it has, as Secretary of State said, it has confirmed that. There's been a cut of 10%, but it's confirmed that rate. However, what we need to do here is make sure that we remember that wind farm developers, the successful ones, are those that build long-term relationships with those communities, that they have experience that's positive, so when they build their next scheme, people are able to say, okay, well, I know someone in my neighbouring region, and they had a positive view of what happened. So it's in developers' interest to engage and make sure we're doing development right. The good developers already do that. This is about making sure there's good practice here. So what we're interested in is wind having a future and being a viable technology out to the 2020 and beyond, because onshore wind is a cost-effective renewable technology, and therefore we are going to see more of it meeting more of our energy needs, provided that it maintains that support which it already has in the community.
Just on that point, and to you, Ed, obviously the level of ROCs was retained the same, and the challenge for onshore wind to go against lots of the critics of renewable energy technologies, when is this going to be able to compete in an open market? And you talked about the need to try and get to a market system soon, and obviously to the chap's point about UKIP and kind of opposition, it links to that. I mean, how do you see these decisions to do with community benefits? Do you see it more likely that we're going to get to a kind of subsidy-free onshore wind technology sooner?
Well, the whole premise behind electricity market reform and moving from new obligations to feed-in tariffs contracts for difference, which is a great phrase, feed-in tariffs contracts for difference. They may make a song about that one day. But moving to these new investment instruments is about creating a market which ultimately won't have subsidies. I mean, we're trying to make the move to a decarbonised energy system in the cheapest way possible. And that's the whole purpose. So renewable low carbon subsidies over time are reduced. That's the whole premise of what we want to do. It would be a mug to say that we know exactly when that's going to be, but by bringing more competition, by bringing more auctions ultimately at the end of this decade into play, that should really drive competition, drive market forces. The answer, Simon's point, the answer to your question is no, I haven't had that conversation. But to take the substance of your point, we do need to change the dialogue in energy. It does need to be in a wider context, both of climate change and indeed how you help people struggling with bills, the fuel poor. So there's a number of dimensions to this. And one of the things I hope we can get from the community energy strategy is helping communities, whether they're local authority led or whether they're third sector led or whether they're faith group led or however the community defines itself and organises itself, to have that different dialogue. And in the community call for evidence on community energy strategy, which I do recommend you all read and respond to, I think that's the third time I've said that. Yeah. It talks about energy in all its forms, and it talks to different types of communities in order to promote that debate. It's very difficult for... I always think it's odd if governments say, well, we're going to tell people what they're going to talk about. Governments can't actually do that, but they can create frameworks to facilitate those debates if people want them to happen. Richard?
It's an observation which links Simon's point about local dialogue with the point about bargaining power, which I don't think we return to, because I think one of the reasons why there isn't much a local discussion is that for all talk about community benefits, planning generally, especially for major infrastructure, has become more streamlined, more centralised, and all about expediting delivery, which really makes local dialogue relatively irrelevant, we might say, because the national policy statements plus the new post-IPC arrangements should have made that all relatively unimportant to development outcomes. So you do have this kind of bifurcation between, on the one hand, government obviously having an interest in having dialogue with communities, but not for the big stuff. Increasingly that should be dealt with by Westminster, and communities can discuss it, but ultimately can't really do much about it.
Okay, I'll take some more questions. One there.
Hi, Matt Hope from Carbon Brief. I just had a question about timeframes on this, really. What if we do this and it doesn't work? I mean, Richard was talking about there's that middle section. We don't know that much about the public that's being targeted here. What if that middle group aren't big enough? Is it a case of simply adding more money, which perhaps isn't viable, as has already been mentioned? And how many times can you revise this and reiterate this before perhaps something more radical has to be done to really get communities on board with this, potentially?
And then we'll take, there was another hand.
Jacoby Harris from Green Economics Institute. Will this community incentive ever be applied retroactively, and if not, why not?
Will this community benefits
be applied retroactively? So, do you want to comment on those 2 points? What is the measure of success, I think, was the part of Matt's question.
Well, we've got those 3 objectives of energy policy. They're the measures of success. Decarbonising, we've got to keep on a path which is both credible and is engaging those investments. So, and I was asked this question the other week about electricity market reform, which is all about bringing on low carbon. And over the next 2 years, the question will be, are we seeing major investments announced? That will be a critical test, and in all forms of low carbon. If by the time we get to the next election, everyone said, well, you know what, we're not going to invest in the United Kingdom, we don't think they've got the policy wrong, then we'll be in trouble. We'll have made huge mistakes. In regard to onshore wind specifically and this approach, We haven't set ourselves, particular targets. We still have the renewables roadmap, which says by 2020 we want to get to up to 13 gigawatts. We're on path to that. We're on track. It's not a target, but it's a particular pathway which would enable us to meet our legal obligation under the Renewables Energy Directive, which is to get 15% of our energy from renewable sources, with 30% of electricity come from renewable sources. So we're on track for that. And if we were to go off that track, then I think that would be a problem. But personally, I think this will probably help us, not hinder us. The question about...
It was about retroactive.
No, it is not retrospective. If you ask why not, because that would be unfair on the developers, and that would be like a retrospective tax. And if you've ever been on a finance bill committee, when the issue of retrospective taxation comes up, you'll know that people get hot under the collar about it. Having served on 9 finance bill standing committees in my time in Parliament, don't do anything that's retrospective if you can possibly avoid it.
Matt, do you want to come on that first?
On the first point, I think a measure of success is the continued deployment of renewables and onshore wind specifically. And that goes back to what I said before about the fact that onshore wind has a good future as a technology. It is cost effective and affordable compared to other low carbon generation. Its costs are understood. It can protect us from future fuel risks, say from having to import more fuels. In comparison to other generation technologies, it can be built quickly. And if costs fall and all other things being equal, we can expect it to continue to therefore have a role. But to do that, it needs to be something that is seen as being beneficial both for the economy and for communities, be that through ownership or be that through good schemes coming forwards. If we're not doing that, we're not doing a very good job as a renewables industry anyway, so therefore it's a bit of a no-brainer.
Even if we thought that community benefits wouldn't affect development outcomes much for wind, it's still a very important debate in terms of the extent of the fairness, the extent to which communities can participate better in energy transition. And even though a lot of onshore wind is actually already in the planning system now, there are other technologies to which these kinds of debates, which wind has in a way trailblazed, could be applied. Fracking and gas is one, the offshore realm is other, division of Crown estate royalties are all sorts of other relevant areas for thinking about who should benefit and by how much from energy exploitation.
Do you want to come in on that, on the fracking question in this context, in terms of what lessons are we going to be able to transfer? Are they going to get a slightly different regime?
I think every regime is likely to be different because the revenue flows, the exploration, the commercialisation are going to be different. So we did look at whether we should have a completely overarching approach to community benefits, and it was just going to be too tricky to design. And frankly, we'll probably be here in about 3 years' time worrying about the exact design. And to be honest, whether it's decarbonising or looking at the shale gas opportunity, I think you just get on with it and make sure that it's fit for purpose. People will obviously compare and contrast and work out whether a community is getting more or less from a particular community benefit proposition that we put forward, but we will try to both make it fair for those people in the community, as was said, but also to signal that communities have to be engaged with by developers.
Okay, time for probably 2 more questions, and ask for them very brief. The lady there in the second row there. Then we'll go to Jess.
Phoebe Cook from politics.co.uk. I think it was Math who talked about the problems of defining what a community is, and I wondered if the government had any set idea of how the community will be defined. Will it be done kind of geographically, or I wondered about that. And also, are there any concrete plans for how community input on wind farm planning will actually manifest itself in terms, would it be done by polls or meetings, and how will the debate actually be encouraged in practice?
Okay, so some technical questions on the process, and then the last question from down here in the second row, yeah?
It might be slightly repetitive to Matt's question, actually. So I'm Jessica Shanklin from Business Green, but about the success, it seems like there's not many people who can be swayed by community incentives. The number of onshore wind farms being built won't necessarily change that much. and voters aren't really that swayed by wind energy when it comes to the polls. Is there any real way, and also we don't know any figures about how much community benefits have worked in the first place. Is there really any way of measuring this success in the first place, or will it just be all be the same? Is the success just, will it quieten down those 100 Tory MPs?
I'll start with Richard and we'll work our way backwards, and this is last responses.
Okay, I think my main point is just to define success more widely than delivery. Maybe all sorts of reasons why this is an interesting agenda beyond whether or not it's the anemometer of wind farm delivery starts to twitch in the right direction. The question of defining the community is an important one because there's certainly worries that if you define it badly, then community benefits can sometimes be divisive, or that if it's defined too narrowly, the small communities concerned have difficulty dealing with what can sometimes be quite large sums of money. But often, communities can be quite pragmatic about this, and you may start by simply giving funds. That's our local parish council to do local things. But often over time, they become more expansive in their view. They become able to see that some of this money spent more widely on wider agendas is more important. And actually, as you have large community benefit funds, so the scope for satisfying multiple constituencies becomes a lot easier than when the sums were relatively small.
You asked about how it will be done, so in terms of how developers should engage. Clearly developers do have open days, seminars, sessions, etc., drop-in sessions. The more of that is done, the better. The guidance that is being developed will clarify, as it were, what's good practice, what's appropriate, and that's important for helping communities understand what to expect, what they should be looking to do as a group. But there is no single community. There are, in reality, in a local area, lots of different communities in terms of how people define themselves. So you should avoid trying to see people as a homogenised group and say, well, we've asked them, so that's okay. There are different groups within that. In terms of whether it makes a difference, I hope it will. But whether it makes a difference isn't in those high-level numbers. It's in the detail of how it's done. The discussion about the community benefits, and it shouldn't be just about the amount, but it should be about how it is spent. And critically, as was said by the Secretary of State, it's a voluntary mechanism. Voluntary is important for one key respect, because it then becomes a conversation and an agreement between the developer and the community about how that funding is used. And the community needs to sign up and buy into that, because it will be the community that takes a lot of responsibility for the use of that fund. So this isn't about something being decided by government, it's not something about being decided by industry. If communities are engaged in that way, they'll see the benefit of the money not by thinking about how much it is in £1 per megawatt, but what difference it has made to them. And the developers will see about what difference it makes to them in terms of them being a good neighbour alongside their community for their individual site.
Sorry, we're going to have to go take it up afterwards because we're running out of time, and the Secretary of State's people will shoot me.
We're not quite that. This is DEC after all, not the MOD. But your question about how do we see communities? We allow communities and developers to sort that out themselves. I mean, we did consider whether we should, and this new approach, be very prescriptive and say it should be like this or like that. That way is a really bad approach. I mean, people have been having these debates in communities up and down the country already for quite some time without government telling them how to do it. And I think that's the approach I prefer, to be brutally honest. And so I think that's the way it will continue. This question, will it make a difference? Well, I generally think it will do. The thing about incentives, someone who really believes in incentives, actually, they can go either way. There's something called the backward bending labour supply curve. Something you should always, every first year economics undergraduate should remember. Namely, that a politician will tell you if you reduce your taxes, people will work harder and work more. The backward bending labour supply curve tells you that some people only want a certain amount of income, and if they get a tax cut and they've got their objective level of income, they'll actually work less hours. That's what the backward bending labour supply. I've been wanting to say that for a long time. But what that says is every individual has a different approach to incentives. So what's going to be interesting with these community benefits and the increase in them It's how communities will engage with them, whether they'll take an individualistic route and say, right, we all want money off our energy bills, or whether they'll continue, as has been the case hitherto, mostly the community projects where they've come together and say that some social capital we want to take from this, whether it's investing in maybe buying a wind turbine or investing in energy efficiency or some training project for the young people in the community or a community hall, all the different things that can be done. And once again, it's not for government to tell people. It may be that in a particular community, they'll say, actually, this is a poor community, we're struggling with our finances, we really want people's bills to be cut. But I think when you start having that discussion, I think you will find communities saying, actually, I'm really pleased we're being engaged with, I'm really pleased we're seeing there's something in it for us. And you know what, actually, these wind developers, they aren't as bad as certain people told us they were.
That's great. We're going to have to end it there with another suggestion for the onshore wind folk songbook title, Backward Bending Labour Supply Curve. Get that in. That will be a bestseller, I'm sure. I'd like you all just to thank the panel for an excellent discussion.